Welcome to MidLIFE Matters, where we celebrate women's wisdom and wit. I'm Georgian Lussier, your host, and I am delighted to introduce today's guest, Karen Caffrey. Karen is working to change the state of Connecticut laws regarding access to adoption records, working on behalf of adult adoptees. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today.
I'm excited. I think we're all going to learn a lot from you, and I really appreciate you coming on. You're working very hard to give every Connecticut resident access to their original birth information.
Exactly. And, I noticed you used the phrase adoption records, which actually is a very broad term. It covers a lot of information, records in an adoption agency, court files. Our purpose in our group, which is called Access Connecticut, is limited only to original birth certificates, which everybody has. You have one, I have one, whether you're adopted or not. You have an original birth certificate that was created when you were born. The difference for adoptees is that in most states, adoptees do not have the legal right to obtain a copy of that. So we've made some progress here in Connecticut in the past couple of years in changing that law, and we're continuing our work.
You have a legal background, and you are now in also the practice of counseling, and I understand a lot of your clients are women.
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
Yep.
How is it you became involved with Access Connecticut?
Well, I am an adoptee. I guess that we should probably state that. So it's been a lifelong path for me to my own adoption life and the issues around adoption. I actually was involved in adoption and this advocacy issue in the 90s. And it was a little premature in terms of where society was at the time. I think also it was perhaps not the time for me. Being one of the upsides of being a woman in her 50s is that I think I'm a little more confident of my own power, more certain of what I think is right, and a little bit more willing to be out in the world with it. So, like I said, I was involved in the 90s. I kind of left the movement for a while, and maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I started kind of getting involved again on the periphery. And then literally one day, about a little over 2 years ago, I kind of just woke up one day and said, I'm not going to take this anymore. I kind of just got angry again, and in a motivating way. Like, this is something that really, I have a lot of clients I see who are adopted, and they would come into my office, and this is an issue for them. That they're treated unequally under the law, that they don't have the right to have information about themselves. I just thought, who's going to speak for them? Who's going to speak for us? I got very re-energized, and again, it was about 2 years ago, it was 2013, got re-involved.
That's fascinating in terms of a process. It must have been churning underneath, and then something like caused it to. And
that, I will tell you, for adoptees is very common. There's a process of moving forward, wanting something, more information, or making an emotional step around your own adoption, and then there's a stepping back. Life goes on, maybe an integrating of whatever it is that you learned or needed to know. And then there's a return later on, and it could be 6 months later, 6 years later. So I have gone in and out of this issue, like many adoptees, for a lot of years.
Access Connecticut goes back 40 years.
Well, the reason, the movement in Connecticut to restore the right to original birth certificates began in 1975, because that's when the right was taken away. Up until 1975, it was the legal right of all adoptees, adult adoptees, and the adoptive parents of minors to obtain a copy of the adoptee's original birth certificate. So, for example, when I was adopted here in Connecticut, I'm not going to say the exact date, but I am a midlife woman, my adoptive parents were given my birth name by the placement agency. So this right was taken away in what's called a post-public hearing amendment. There wasn't a public hearing on it. It was part of a larger adoption bill. One legislator got up and said, I think we should change this. And about that time, the adoptee rights movement was born in Connecticut, and it has taken this long to get where we are today. So there's been many advocates, many iterations of the group. This most recent organization and the corporation that we founded to work on this law has just been around a couple of years.
So there were very different social values 40 years ago and prior to that time views, myths?
The underlying issue around adoption historically has been when a woman would become pregnant and give birth out of wedlock, as they would say. Often we're talking very young women, teenagers, so there was a tremendous amount of societal shame and stigma around that. Historically, when a child was born to a married couple, the parents would be put on the birth certificate. If a child was born to a woman who was not married, their birth certificate was stamped illegitimate. And this is the document that a human being would go through life. You want to go get married, you want to join the military, you need your birth certificate for a passport. You show it to the government official or whoever, and it says illegitimate, or probably shouldn't say the word, but there's less nice words for that. It was actually government stamped on people's birth certificates. So historically, there's been many different ways that social workers and others have tried to address that. Adoption had its equivalent of sort of a don't ask, don't tell period. We'll pretend it didn't happen, and we'll just keep these things a secret. There's a lot of secrecy historically around adoption. Although, as I'm sure your listeners know, that has changed a lot. Modern adoption is much more emphasizing transparency, truth amongst all the participants. So it's changed a lot, even since the 70s, but certainly since maybe the 40s or 50s.
What do you think was the reason that the law was changed in 1975 to begin with?
It was a single legislator, and what we can see from the legislative record is that a single teenager searched. I don't know the circumstances. Somebody was unhappy, whether it was her adoptive parents, whether it was whatever her biological mother or father, but there was one bad story, and or one bad situation. And again, since there was no, I don't know how familiar you are with the legislative process, but typically, if there's a very important issue, there's public hearings and people come and testify, and there's a lot of attention, and there's sort of a process we go through as a society about what kind of law to enact. This particular change didn't go through that. It was just an amendment thrown up in the last minute. It went through. Nobody probably even noticed for a while. But the times were such, and the amount of myth and misinformation and stigma around this information was so big that it's been like a Herculean effort across the country and other states as well to restore this right for a human being like myself to know where they came from.
Well, this grassroots organization, of which you are now president,
Woohoo!
yay, has had a huge success milestone just this year.
Yes, the bill actually that we were able to advocate for was passed in 2014. It became effective July 1 of this year, and it restored the right of adult adoptees who were adopted in Connecticut after October 1, 1983, to have access to their original birth certificates. And we had a big ceremony at the Capitol. Department of Public Health Commissioner Jewel Mullen got up and presented for original birth certificates to eligible adoptees. We had a big crowd. It was a really big celebration. We're very pleased and proud of that work that we did.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to actually see something happen in such a positive way.
Yes, it is. It was very inspiring, I think, for all of us to have an experience of being able to affect our community, our laws. So many people today don't feel empowered. They don't have a sense of agency. Like, why should I vote? Why should I speak? Doesn't make any difference. And to actually get a group of people together who collectively spoke and were able to make something happen was a magnificent experience, I think, for everybody, for all of us.
And as you shared with me, it seemed like things came together. Could you talk a little bit about what some of those forces were that lined up?
Oh, there's a lot of synchronicity. Frankly, the group of us that came together in 2013, there were a few other people, our Vice President, Carol Goodyear, who you've met. At the same time, I was sort of having my, get mad moment. She was having I want to do something about this moment. So there were a number of advocates who sort of collected together and said, let's really put some organization and force into this. There was a legislator, his name is David Alexander, who, again, serendipitously, had just been elected and is an adoptee, and literally became aware that he did not have the right to his original birth certificate like the year before in a public hearing. I wasn't actually there at the time, but apparently he was sitting right there and said, "What do you mean I don't have this right?" So he was highly motivated. We had a wonderful lobbyist who had a family connection to adoption, Matt Hallisey, who has been incredible, has really worked with us and got to know the issue and has spent a tremendous amount of time helping us learn how to affect the government and our legislators. And a whole team of people, legislators, different constituents, people who this matters to, and maybe you're not going to see them on the front page of the Hartford Courant or here on your show, but who are quietly and committedly making contacts and saying this is something that's important to us. And the governor signed the bill. Well, thank you, Governor Malloy. It is not over until that signature is drying, and then you have a law.
And how does that change someone's life? Why is it so important?
Boy, there's a filmmaker named Gene Strauss who has done a lot of actual filming of adoptees being handed their original birth certificates in other states, like walking up to the clerk and the registrar and holding it. And many of them simply cry. It's hard to, I think, for the non-adopted to understand how disenfranchising it is to not be allowed to know something so fundamental that every other citizen is allowed to have. You know, I've thought about it. The right to vote for women, for example, is a relatively new thing. I mean, my mother lived at a time when there was no right for women to vote, and I think about, like, imagine the very first time you go to vote and no other woman has had the right to vote before you. I mean, you would just go do it just so you could say, you could feel like, oh my gosh, I'm participating in democracy in my society. So some of it's like that, just the basic, I am an equal citizen to others. And then there's many other practical impacts. For many adoptees, that's the first place they find out their birth identity. Some adoptees choose to search for the biological relatives. Many different reasons for that. For some, it's medical history. That is a very important thing that adoptees are lacking, most adoptees. You know, you go into the doctor's office and the first thing you do is complete a medical history form. And there's a lot of them have a form that says adopted. And what that means is you can't fill that out. Heart attack in your family, history of cancer, history, don't know. That affects treatment. Some are looking for, something as small as a picture, to look in the face of another human being and see yourself. Until I was 19, I never looked upon the face of a blood relative. And I remember as a teenager, I would look in the mirror and think, well, I'm obviously Caucasian, but I wonder what I am. I wonder what my birth mother looks like. I wonder if I have any siblings. I wonder if do I have grandparents? Do I look like them? As it turns out, by the way, I am the spitting image of my birth father. A little scary. My mother, my father. But that kind of thing. That, again, if you're not adopted, you just grow up and we all us Caffreys have whatever we have. Matter of fact, here's the thing. I don't know if you can see this in the camera, but the very first time I spoke on the phone with my birth parents, one of the first questions out of my birth mother's mouth, she says, "Do you have a space between your front teeth?" Now, mine is actually closed up a bit as I've aged, but I used to have this really big space. Well, apparently everybody has a big space. It's nothing. And yet, when you have no biological relatives, it's everything. It's one of the things that ties you to a sense of being part of the human family. So I think that's a long answer to your question.
That's a wonderful answer. And I believe we have a picture that you submitted to me of both of my mothers.
Yes.
Could you just talk a little bit how that picture came to be?
Oh, yeah. My adoptive mother passed this year, so it's a little sad to think of. But no, thank you. She lived a very long, good life. That picture was taken, I think, in 1988. I had searched for and found my birth family about a decade before that, but my birth brother-in-law worked for a magazine, and he wrote, it was D Magazine. It's called Triangle of Love, by the way, if anybody wants to read the article. We had a professional photographer for D Magazine, I think his name is Raymond Gervais, had a photo shoot. We sat down. We had some beautiful pictures from that day. So one of the things I like to do, I like to ask people which which mother is which mother. If you look at that picture, who do you think is my birth mother and who do you think is my adoptive mother? And I'd say about half the people guess wrong. It's kind of interesting. So, but yeah, that was, so my mom and I, my adoptive mother and I flew down and were interviewed and took those pictures, and it was a wonderful day.
That sounds like, talk about a full circle kind of an experience.
That's exactly what it was like.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it was really full circle. And my mother's had a good relationship. My birth family's from Texas, so there was a lot of distance, so it's not like they could be having coffee with each other, but they knew each other, for however many years before, 35 years before my mother passed. So, yeah, it was, not every connection like this is as, successful or fairy tale sort of ending as mine has been. Even adoptees who have, less happy stories, almost every one of them says, I'm glad I know, and I really, whether I'm glad or not, I have the right to know.
I would think it's like any family situation. I mean, I don't know anyone I know who would say we have the perfect family.
Nobody I know either.
No, right, particularly in your business.
Right.
But it's your family.
Yeah.
And so I can understand where that would be so important, to be able to claim that right, to at least see who the players are and the history of the relationships and, things people have in common, things people don't. But again, making sense of who am I? Right,
making sense of who am I. And it's when you said, this reminded me, for some reason, there must be biology here, but I have two, as it happens, full biological sisters. And one of them, her laugh is so much like mine that occasionally, when I laugh, I will do a double take for a second and think my sister's in the room. Okay. Now that kind of thing, it's a small thing that you wouldn't even notice if you weren't adopted, but it's an important thing. One of the myths in adoption is that biological families don't matter, and that they're not your family. And people get very, I'll put my therapist hat on in a moment. One of the damaging things is, historically, is this some sort of sense of either or that can come involved with birth versus adoptive family. The question, who is your real mother, just makes me want to scream. Both my mothers are real. And to set up sort of a false competition, they're my mothers in different ways. And I think that's a worrisome thing, and I think it creates a lot of fear in adoptive families, fear in the adoptee. Am I being disloyal? Is this somehow a criticism of my adoptive family if I want to know something about my origins? So that's something that I think is getting sorted out more in modern times, as a lot of the shame around women's sexuality and pregnancy has not gone, but less than it used to be.
And speaking of modern times, I know we had touched on the topic that there's several forces at work that are accelerating and really changing the direction of adoption issues. Social media, in terms of being able to make connections that previously would have been extremely painstaking and unlikely. DNA testing.
Yes, we had a great meeting with a senator just a couple days ago. We're talking about this very issue. We're trying to change laws, which we consider to be antiquated. But what's really happening in the real world is technology, like DNA testing, is so rapidly outpacing these laws. Not that they shouldn't be changed. An unjust law is an unjust law, but DNA testing is. And I can explain why it might take a little bit too long. You do not have to test a particular person to find that they're in your family tree. Let's say, for example, I'll do a very quick little summary. Let's say I have my DNA tested, and then way over there is some first or second cousin, and they have their DNA tested, and all that information goes into a database. And I think there's about 3 million people in the United States who've done this. Doesn't sound like a lot out of 300 and however many million of people live here. But let's say this is where they are. Now what's going to happen is you put this into the database, and the computer will tell you that up here, let's say grandfather or grandmother, great-grandfather, that you'll get an email saying, hey, you're connected to this person through here, through this grandfather. So it doesn't take too much sleuthing, or it does take sleuthing at this point, but the more pieces of the DNA tree that get put in, there's less and less sleuthing. And then the other thing is, this is very public. This isn't, I get my birth certificate and make a confidential phone call or letter to you and say, hey, I think we are connected. This is, I get an email from this guy over here and says, hey, I think that you're our great-grandparents, I think we're related, and is there anybody who you can think of who might have had a child out of wedlock? Because I think that might be my mother. This is not private.
Right.
So technology is really moving ahead, which is not uncommon with laws. I'll put my law hat on. It's very common right now for science to be outpacing the capacity of the law to keep up with it. But yes, and social media, Facebook, which is... you can turn, I follow a lot of this, but it's not uncommon now. You see adoptees, adult adoptees, and they have a big poster and it says,
yes,
I was born on this date.
right.
And
this is the information I have. I've shared those.
Yes,
I'm like, if this person's on this quest, I'm going to help, and just, who knows?
Again, one of the advocates I know took one of those, and one of these posters had 1 million views. Now, first of all, that to me is just incredibly inhuman to put a person in the position that they have to publicly go to the world in that way. It's also not private.
No.
But desperate things make for desperate actions. And if a medical need, or you just are like a typical human being and want to know where you came from, this is what people do. And actually, it works. I mean, many people are able to use social media and DNA testing now to to get around these laws. In addition to, private searching, private detectives. I found my biological family before the internet, which was an interesting process, a little detective work. But, yeah.
What are other states doing, and what states might be a model for us?
Actually, our neighbors, Rhode Island, Maine, and New Hampshire, all have access laws. The most recent one was passed in Rhode Island in 2011. There are, I think, 6 or 8. I actually wrote it down, but I'm not. Let's see. It's Alabama, Alaska, and Kansas never had secrecy, ever. I guess they just never got around to doing it. So, and then there's Alabama, Oregon, which is one. There's a story there. One of the big first big breaking the glass ceiling kind of states. Let's see. Who am I missing? Tennessee. So other states are doing this. There's advocacy movements in many states. And then there's sort of because this is governed by state law, not federal law, there is a mishmash of laws governing access in different states. For example, we are part of the mishmash now. We have a time zone. If you're after 83, you've got this right. If you're before 83, you don't, which is what our group is doing now. We're going to go back to the legislature in 2016, starting in February, and try and extend access so all adoptees have this right.
Arbitrary.
There actually was it's a compromise. There was a reason. There's an affidavit in Connecticut that all biological parents have signed since 1983 when they terminate the right to their children. That says, I understand that my adult child may be given information that identifies me. So that was kind of something people could hang their hat on as a first step.
Okay.
And we were like, okay, first steps are great.
First steps are great.
Yeah.
Yes, much better than no steps, absolutely. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your background. I know you do some writing. You've contributed to some anthologies.
Yeah.
As an adult adoptee, as a therapist.
Yep.
And I read one of your sections. I thought it was very heartfelt and supportive. And you were just, not being adopted myself, certainly I had a lot of, and still do, I'm sure, ignorance or just blindness around what the issues are that people face.
And that was probably the Adoptee Survival Guide, which is actually the personal stories of adoptees.
Okay.
And, and don't be hard on yourself because, frankly, in our culture, it hasn't been kosher for adoptees to tell their stories. There was sort of this fairy tale, we're all happy and we're going to pretend this never happened. So it's really only recently. The field of adoptee literature, progressive adoption literature in general, is exploding. And we're going to hear a lot more voices now, which is wonderful. The Lost Daughters have a blog, a group of young adoptees who have a lot to say about this.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So you started as an attorney. Was that your
Yes,
first career?
it was.
We talked about stages here.
Yes, I love your book.
Thank you.
About the 3 stages of women's sort of personal, professional life. It very much spoke to me. My first stage was being an attorney. I became an attorney because I very strongly believed in women's rights. My mother had a strong sense of justice, was a feminist, had gotten a college education at a time where that wasn't very common.
Mm-hmm.
I went to law school and became a lawyer and did not end up practicing the kind of law that was advocacy, just kind of did some traditional law. And after about 10 years, actually about 5 years, I realized it just did not make my heart sing. It just didn't make my heart sing, and life is too short to do something that doesn't make your heart sing, at least if you can possibly avoid it. So I had gotten into my own therapy, personal therapy, and I found it very meaningful, very helpful. So I went back to school, got a master's in counseling psychology, and began a career as a psychotherapist. I've done that now for 20 something years. And then this is my third, this is zenith, I think is the word.
Wonderful, yes.
This is my third phase, although I'm continuing being a therapist because I didn't go into advocacy because I didn't like what I'm doing. Right. I still love being a therapist. I feel very privileged to have that work. But this is just sort of a different kind of love.
And I think we can stack things on. It doesn't have to be you end one thing and go. I mean, your legal background, I'm sure, informs a lot of the work you've been able to do to help with this. So that whole bringing it all together is just so profound.
Yes, and I like that word stacking because, yes, I don't practice law, but I have all that in my brain. And it forms.
You didn't give it up.
Didn't give
it up.
You
didn't sign away the rights.
No. Technically, my law license is retired. I've been retired for 20 years from law, but again, you don't take it out of your brain, and it's the skill, the thinking, the skill set, the knowledge, that's very helpful.
Thinking of your younger self, is there any advice you would give to your younger self?
Oh, boy. I was at the United Church of Christ conference this past weekend because they actually enacted an adoptee rights resolution. It was an amazing experience to be there. And somebody got up and there's a new conference president, Reverend John Dorauer, I think his name was, and someone said, we're going into this election time now, and do you have any pastoral advice for us? Which I thought, that's a good question. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, it's going to be okay. And it did not in a cliched or a trite way, but more in a faithful way. And I think for my younger self, when I think of ourselves, when I think of the times that I struggled, that I would like to say back to her, it's going to be okay. It's going to be real hard times. There's going to be struggles, but you're going to be okay.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to close with a quote that we've mutually agreed on that you suggested. And that is from Ruth Gordon, who said, "Courage is like a muscle. We strengthen it by use."
Yes.
So carry on with all this good work. And thank you so much for being a guest.
Oh, thank you for having me and listen to our adoptee rights issues.
Yes. And please tune in to hear other fascinating women on Midlife Matters in future episodes. Georgian Lussier, your host. Thanks again.